Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this FAFSA training for those of you who guide our students. I'm Kathy McDonald, Assistant Director for Network Partnerships with the Florida College Access Network. Many thanks to our partners, the Florida Association of Student Financial Aid Administrators, the Florida Office of Student Financial Assistance, and the Florida School Counselor Association, who worked collaboratively to make this training possible. Before we get started today, a few housekeeping items. First, we welcome your questions. Please bring them to us. We have lots of FAFSA members who will be working behind the scenes to answer your questions. So you're going to use the Q&A feature in your dashboard. I know many of you are familiar with Zoom and used to putting questions in the chat. We're not going to do it in the chat today. We're going to do it in the Q&A. So find that feature on your computer and on your dashboard and put the questions in there. We're excited to hear what's on your mind, what the stumbling blocks are for you so that we can make sure we can get you the support you need. Finally, this webinar is being recorded. We will put a link to the recording on the Florida FAFSA Challenge page on the FCAN website in case you want to listen to it again or share it with colleagues. So that'll take us probably a couple of days. I would say by mid next week that should be up. If you are already subscribed and registered with one of our College Ready Florida initiatives, we will let you know via that e-blast that the recording is now available. And this morning is focused on you and giving you the information you need to help students complete a FAFSA. We are also working with these partners and others to put on a FAFSA how-to walkthrough session for students and parents. That will be on October 19th from 6 to 7:30. The registration is now open, so please let your students and parents know that they can see an example of filling out the FAFSA step by step. We will be sharing this in upcoming newsletters. So again, if you're registered for the initiatives, you'll already be getting that, but you can see the URL on your screen. That's the URL you send students and parents to so that they can register to attend that session. So that's available to you and your students. So with that, now let me welcome the FAFSA president, Katie Conrad, who's going to help get us started. And let me go ahead and stop sharing my screen. There we go. Katie, welcome.
Thank you, Kathy. Good morning, everyone. As Kathy said, I am the president of the Florida Association of Student Financial Aid Administrators, and I'm also the Senior Associate Director of Financial Aid at Florida International University. It's so good to have you all with us here virtually today. And I wanted to start by, of course, thanking our partners at FCAN, OSFA, and the Florida School Counselor Association. As Kathy mentioned, this truly is a collaborative effort among all of these organizations. As financial aid administrators, we understand how important it is for high school counselors to have the best information about financial aid and the application process. A couple of years back, our association began working with FCAN to ensure that you receive the training that you need to assist your students. And today's training is a result of that partnership. And we are so pleased that through their connections with all of you, we can present this information today. In the next 2 years, we will see significant changes to the FAFSA to simplify the process for students. So while these changes will bring simplification and greater clarity for students and families, we will all need to update our knowledge base and our vocabulary and how we talk about completing the FAFSA. So next year, we do plan to offer financial aid workshops for the Florida high school counselors at 5 regional locations across the state. So please watch for those announcements and plan to attend those workshops next fall. And then finally, thank you for the work that you do to support the high school seniors in their pursuit of a higher education. We know that without your guidance and persistence, that many capable students would not realize their dream of education beyond high school. So thank you for being here today, and we look forward to greeting you, hopefully in person next year. So with that, I will turn it over to our esteemed presenters, Daniel and Karima.
So Katie, before you go, I just want to say one of the pieces of feedback we got last time was the confusion between FAFSA and FASFA. We have the worst acronym in the history of acronyms for our association. But I just want for the public record to note that FASFA was there long before there was a FAFSA. So FASFA has a 50-year history of serving the financial aid community in Florida. The FAFSA hasn't been around that long. So I'm impressed at your ability to keep them straight. It's not easy.
It is not easy.
Yes.
Thank you for that clarification, Daniel.
Yes, no problem, no problem. And welcome, Karima.
Thank you. Technology, the gift, the curse.
Yes, exactly. So let's introduce ourselves. My name is Daniel Barkowitz, and I am the Assistant Vice President for Financial Aid and Veterans Affairs at Valencia College here in beautiful downtown Orlando, Florida. Actually, I'm in Metro West today at our Metro West campus. And just down University Road from me is my good friend and colleague, Karima. So Karima, let you introduce yourself.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Dr. Karima Campbell-Mansell. I'm one of the Associate Directors in the Office of Student Financial Assistance at the University of Central Florida.
And we are a partnership all the time, but today, but today we're a partnership to help educate you about financial aid. We promise that the next 4 hours of education about financial aid will be fun. Just kidding. We only have about 2 hours of material we're going to share with you. Fun, educational, and informational, believe it or not. So I'm going to go ahead and get my PowerPoint started. Actually, before we do that, we did want to get some information about you all because we certainly have combined lots of years of experience in financial aid, but we're curious to know some things about you. So Kathy, I'm going to ask, would you mind, let's turn the poll on. I believe there are 2 poll questions. So here's this first one. Let us know, how many years of experience do you have working in guidance counseling? So had less than 1 year, 1 to 3 years, 4 to 6, 7 to 10, or 11 plus. How many years of experience do you have working in your profession? Kathy, how are we doing with responses?
We are doing great. Okay, it looks like, whoops, they are starting to slow down. So let me end the poll and share the results. We have a pretty experienced group here.
We do. Okay, good. That's good to know. So about 40% of you have 11 plus years of experience. That's awesome. And the rest are somewhere divided. We have some folks who have 9% of you who have less than 1 year of experience. So this presentation, we're going to get into some pretty detailed information, but we'll also make sure to cover the groundwork for those of you that have 3 or less years of experience as well. So you'll get the information you need. But years of experience can be a proxy for how much you know about this process. But we thought we'd ask you a specific question. How much do you know about the application process for financial aid? So let's launch that second question. So we've asked you a couple of questions here about how familiar are you with the application process? FAFSA, what's a FAFSA? I know enough to be dangerous, but not really enough to answer any questions. I've helped apply for aid for a student, for myself, for my family. People ask me for advice on how to complete the applications, or I could be leading this presentation. And for those of you that answer that one, we'll be coming back to you to talk about next year's presentation. So.
Yeah, especially with all the presentations this time of year. Okay, so we're getting some good voting. So
Good.
Let's give it a few more seconds here. Get those votes in. Okay, I think it's starting to slow down. So 1 more second. 3 more seconds. Okay, so let's share those results. So this is a great example of, just because you've been doing this for a very long time doesn't automatically mean you feel super, super comfortable with the ins and outs of FAFSA. Sorry, trying to make sure I'm saying it right.
Easier to say, that's right. So even though we have 11 plus years of experience with a lot of our participants, right? So most people fall sort of squarely in the middle of that comfort level. So that's also helpful for us to know. And again, we'll start sharing some information now about the process, but just keep in mind, we're going to try to deliver content that's going to be relevant for all of you as we go through the process today. So you get a good sense of where we are. And if we're moving too fast, or if there are questions that you don't see answered that you'd like to ask, please feel free to ask them in the Q&A. You won't see their faces, but there are a number of financial aid professionals from around the state who are personing the Q&A section for you. They are there to answer your questions and to provide really great answers about the information you might want to know. So with that, let's dive in. So what are we going to cover today? We're going to cover 4 topics: what financial aid is, where are the sources of financial aid, when and how should you apply for financial aid, and what to do with students who have unique circumstances. So, giving you information to arm you to help students who fall outside of the norm, and knowing how to help those students navigate the process. So to start, let's do a quick overview. So I didn't say this about myself, but I also am the keeper of a blog on financial aid. It's a publicly accessible blog, doesn't speak specifically about Valencia. In fact, if you go there, you won't find my name anywhere on the blog. It's really about financial aid in general. And the blog is at moneymanblog.com. So as we go through the presentation today, you'll see some links down below that take you to particular sections of the blog. And we'll get a copy of this presentation to you as well. And you can feel free to read more, because even though we'll have some time together, we won't have enough time to cover really everything. But this will help you with more information as we go. But here's some good news. In 2019-20, there was over $196 billion, with a B, given out in undergraduate financial aid. That's the great news. What do we know about the challenging news? Well, the challenging news is a lot of that money is loans. If you look at the pie chart on the right side of this column, you'll see federal student loans accounted for about 19%, non-federal loans from private sources about 7%, right? So together, that's about 26% in loans. That's come down over time, believe it or not. In fact, not so long ago, it was over a third. And it's been as higher than that even as things have gone on. You'll see, by the way, sorry, I missed federal parent loans, another 6%. So I remember days where the loan portfolio was 40 or 50% of the money available. What else do you know as you look at this chart? You should notice federal grants are a fairly large portion, about 15%. But look at institutional grants. That is the single largest piece of this pie. It's almost double the size of federal grants. And I want to hit this message home with you, and for you to hit it home with your students. Students need to make sure they're applying for institutional grants at the institutions they're attending, college and university grants. That's really the most important piece, specifically because those institutional grants often have different requirements than just simply the FAFSA. So again, you want to make sure that students are targeting those institutional grants. And we'll come and talk about that a little more as we go on. So type of funding. If you sum up the different pieces here, you'll see grants, scholarships, and VA benefits are about 62%, loans about 32%, tax benefits 6%. We're not going to talk a lot about tax benefits today, or at all, but I will say, just a reminder, families who have a college expense often can deduct part of that expense in that year as a deduction against their income. So as you're advising families, as you're counseling families, just keep in mind that tax benefits could be a benefit that family has as well. Source of funding. Only about half the funding available comes from the federal government. State of Florida does a phenomenal job with sourcing funding, but on average in the country, it's about 6% of funding that, that comes through from the state in terms of the national average. Institutional grants we've talked about, and private sources of funding as well, including grants and loans. And don't forget, this is a manageable process, right? I know for families, sometimes this could feel overwhelming. Our job together, yours and mine, is to help families understand that there is a way through this piece. Nothing frustrates me more than hearing from families how complicated the process is. Our job is to make what might seem complicated on the surface understandable and navigable for families. That's really what we're trying to do. So, the question that often comes up, especially in an environment where the top institutions in the country are charging about $80,000 a year, and we'll talk about their costs in a moment. One of the questions that often comes up is it worth it, right? Is going to college, is paying for college, bearing that cost worth it? Even the cheapest institutions by the time you figure out room, board, living expenses, transportation, all of that, it could be 10, 12,000 or more, up to 15,000 a year for families. So over 4 years, you've got families paying between 60,000 to, $320,000, $350,000. Is it worth it? So what I would say is, let's pull some data and look. So here's the Bureau for Labor Statistics. This is from 2020. And what you'll see on the right side of this chart is the unemployment rate by education level. And you may know this intuitively, you may understand this, but your students may not really grasp it, or your families, until they see this kind of data. What you can see is the higher you get on the educational chart, the much less likely you are to be unemployed. And especially the difference comes in when you hit that bachelor's degree nationally, you hit that bachelor's degree level. What's interesting about Florida, by the way, Florida, if we were to look at this only for Florida, you would see associate level has also a very similar reduction. Nationally, maybe not as much, but FCAN's data shows the impact of even an associate's degree in the state of Florida is high. Same on the income side. So the blue side of this chart shows you income by education level. This is average weekly pay. So again, just simply getting an associate's degree raises your income nationally by about $200, $150 a week. Getting your bachelor's degree almost doubles your take-home pay. The other chart that I like to use, especially now, is this one, because this shows you unemployment rates over time. And that red line on the chart is less than a high school diploma. The light blue line is high school graduates. The darker blue line is college or associate's degree, some college or associate's degree. And the bottom line, the green line, is bachelor's degree. Again, you can see that even in times of trauma, and look at we all know what we've been through over the last several years, you can see how high the unemployment rate spiked for those with less than a college degree, specifically less than a high school degree or a high school degree. And for those with less than a high school degree it really hasn't come back. It's really only those with a college education bachelor's degree that have almost reached where they were pre-pandemic. So, this is also a crisis for those without a degree right now. So this also, I think proves the point. So let's jump into some vocabulary. There are really 3 terms of art that we use in the financial aid profession. And I want to make sure they're clear for you. And again, this may be repeat for some of you, but I want to give you some deep dive into this as well. The 3 terms that we use are cost of attendance, or COA, expected family contribution, or EFC, and financial need. Now, Katie mentioned at the start of this that things are changing. One of the things that's changing is in a couple of years, you're going to hear us stop talking about EFC, and we're going to start talking about something called the Student Aid Index. Don't get confused. It's roughly the same thing. There's some changes in law and some changes to the formula. But for right now, for next year and for the year after, we'll still be using the term EFC, expected family contribution. But let's talk about what these things are. So cost of attendance is a reflection of the total cost to attend our institutions. As financial aid officers, we set a standard cost of attendance for categories of students attending our institution. And that cost of attendance includes all kinds of things. So it's not just direct billed expenses like tuition and fees, but it also includes, if you're living off campus, an allowance for room and board. If you're on campus, it includes room and board on campus. It includes books, transportation, personal expenses, so a whole host of other kinds of expenses that a student or a family may have in trying to pay their college education. So that becomes the cost of attendance. And we'll look at some sample costs of attendance in a moment. The EFC, the expected family contribution, is what a family is determined to be able to contribute toward that cost. And that comes out of the FAFSA process. So when you apply for financial aid, and we'll talk about the forms in a second, then what comes out of that is that expected family contribution. And then the difference is the financial need. So let's go a little deeper into each of these. So cost of attendance. I've picked out a couple of colleges nationally and within the state to show you some sample costs of attendance. If I start at the left side, you'll see I've put Valencia as the first category. And you'll see our costs run between 18 and 28,000. That's our budget. Now, you might think, but I thought Valencia was much cheaper than that. I thought Valencia wasn't that expensive. You'd be right when it comes to tuition, right? So remember, the cost of attendance is more than just tuition. A student going full-time in-state would qualify for about $3,000 as their tuition expense. So what's the rest of that? Well, it's all their other expenses, their room and board, their transportation, their books, their personal expenses, et cetera. You'll also notice that the colleges on the left side of the chart, like UCF, UF, FSU, have 4 lines. Why are there 4 lines? Well, the difference is in-state versus out-of-state tuition. So if I pick on my friend Karima for a moment, at UCF, and this is a great thing, and often our families in Florida forget this, students who are in-state and can document their residency in-state qualify for a humongous subsidy, right? It's a $15,000 subsidy because they're living in-state. I don't know if you want to say anything, Kareem, about the residency or in-state.
Sure. So when our students are deemed in-state residents, they get what we would call in-state tuition. And in-state tuition, as Daniel said, is a huge subsidy for our students. It also, but there are specific documents that students must provide in order to establish their in-state residency. So I'll just be clear in regard to our students graduating from a Florida high school. Typically, those students, in most cases, are going to be deemed in-state residents for tuition purposes. However, there are some times when we have families that recently moved to Florida or families that moved to Florida after a student has started college, or a student who has moved for the purpose of coming to college, and it gets a little bit more complicated when we look at residency reclassification. So just stating, just living in the state of Florida doesn't necessarily deem you an in-state resident for tuition purposes.
And really important, I know at my institution, Karima, the application for residency goes through our admissions or registrar's office, not our financial aid office.
Not financial aid. We're not the residency experts. And I tell students that all the time. Residency is either established by your admissions application and the documentation you provide through the admissions application. And if you are deemed a non-Florida resident through that process, then you go through our registrar's office for a reclassification.
So that's important because often families will approach me in the financial aid office and say, or Karima, and say, how do I become a resident? And it's not something we can help them with. Really, that has to go through the process of working with that office.
But Daniel, one of the things I do want to add is because sometimes students and families think that residency is subjective, it isn't. It's outlined by legislation. So as we're tied to federal regulations and state legislation and financial aid, the residency process is as well.
Absolutely, absolutely. So you'll see for in-state institutions that are public, right, that there is a differentiation. But let's look at an example like Bethune-Cookman. So I picked Bethune-Cookman because I find this fascinating too. At Bethune-Cookman, they have 2 budgets. One budget for folks living off campus or on campus in a dorm room. So if you're living in a residence hall or you're renting an apartment, they give you one allowance. But if you're living at home, or you're living with relatives, they give you a lower allowance. And so you can see the costs of attendance vary there. But then if you start looking at institutions that are generally private institutions, private 4-year not-for-profit institutions generally, they tend to have budgets that are uniform. So, and you can see the range, and I've picked just a couple, but you can see all the way at the right side of this chart, there's Harvard, which, from my research, is one of the most expensive institutions in the country in terms of cost of attendance. And it's at $78,028 a year. That is for those living in Cambridge. If you live out of state or out of country, they add a travel allowance to help pay you for your airfare back and forth. So it could be as high actually as $82,000 a year. Now, most families aren't paying that, just to be very clear, at Harvard. Many, many families qualify for financial aid, and we'll talk a little bit more about that next. So as we talk about the costs, right, if you're counseling a student who's applying to 5 institutions, and the costs vary on those institutions from a high of $70,000 to a low of $10,000, if that student, let's say, goes through the application process and we determine that that student has an EFC, a family contribution of $10,000, the way the financial aid process is designed to work, that student should only have to pay that $10,000 regardless of which institution they are attending, right? So you've got 5 institutions, EFC of 10,000 along all 5. The remainder, or what's on this slide highlighted in yellow, would be their need. That would be what they qualify for in financial aid. And we're going to talk about what makes up that financial aid in a moment. But the basic concept here is that students should choose a college not because of its cost or low cost, but because of what's affordable for them in terms of their EFC. The rest of it can be made up for by financial aid. So moving on, just a final reminder as we sort of close this section. Price is not the same thing as cost, right? Sticker price is what we call the cost of attendance. And I know that's a little complicated, but that's what a lot of students look at and think, I don't think I can afford that. What's more important is to understand a student's net price or true cost. And that's going to be what a family pays after they receive their financial aid. And if you have students who want to figure this out, especially as you're counseling younger students, juniors in high school and younger, one really wonderful way to help families determine this is to use what's called the net price calculator. It's a little secret that a lot of families I find don't know about. Maybe as a counselor, you're familiar with this, but every college in the country is required to have on its webpage something called a net price calculator. That net price calculator allows any member of the public to enter in some basic biographical information and get back an estimate of what their family contribution would be and also their financial aid award. Now, just be aware, obviously, if you put garbage into the calculator, you're going to get garbage back, but it's a really good way to get some basic information about how financial aid works and specifically for that individual family to get an estimate. There is a direct link to every net price calculator in the country at this website, collegecost.ed.gov/net price. You can get a link directly to every college in the country, or you can search the college's webpage to find their net price calculator. Okay, so what is financial aid? Financial aid is made up really of 3 different things. There's grants or scholarships. That's obviously the free money, the best kind of money, the money that we want families to receive because it does not have to be repaid. There is loan money, and we'll come back and talk about loans in a second, and then there's work. Most families are going to wind up using a combination of loans and work as part of their financial aid award. It's Karima used this term, and it's a term of art. It's one I've used as well. It's called self-help. The idea of the loan and work component is to have a student help themselves in paying for their educational expense. So many colleges will put a loan as part of the financial aid offer, and there'll maybe be a work award as well. So let's talk about loans for a second, right? A lot of families get concerned about borrowing, right? They might want to be aware, not to overborrow. And you can read in the newspapers these days, lots of stories about how much students are borrowing. Loans by themselves are not bad. Overborrowing is bad. So how do we determine how much is overborrowing versus, the right amount to borrow? So one piece of advice that we give to families and to students is to have as a cap on your borrowing the amount you expect to earn as your starting salary when you graduate your program. So if you're coming into an educational program and you think that you're going to leave that program earning $20,000 a year, you should borrow no more from all sources. Your student loans, your credit cards, your auto loan, any of that, you should have no more in loans than $20,000. If you're going into a program and you think you're going to graduate with a $50,000 earnings, does that mean you can borrow $50,000 or you should? No, you shouldn't. I mean, again, you should keep your borrowing low, but you have capacity to do that. The other thing is federal loans have lots of repayment options. So even if you're struggling financially, you're unemployed, you're going back to graduate school, there are options to defer or forbear your payments during the time that you're going back to school. So loans by themselves are not a bad thing. And in fact, many families are going to need to borrow loans. And we'll talk more about that, Karima will, a little later in the presentation. And also, I don't want to forget work. Many students find work on campus, often, by the way, in the financial aid office. That's how a lot of us got our start in financial aid, was by working as a work study student. Karima is raising her hand. I did a summer job that got me involved in this profession. So that's often a great way to introduce students to the profession of financial aid as well. Okay, so I'm going to pick on Kathy for a second. Kathy, let's talk about the forms that we need to know. So, Kathy, let's pick a child of yours who might be, in this case, going through the college application cycle. What kid are we going to talk about today?
Let's talk about my son, Liam.
Okay, so Liam is going to apply to college. We're going to make this up because I think Liam is not actually a senior, but let's pretend Liam was a senior in high school. Liam is much younger because you could never be old enough to have a senior in high school. I'm just saying. So let's talk about Liam. Where is Liam applying to college? Let's name some colleges.
UF,
UF,
Northwestern,
Northwestern,
USF,
USF,
HCC,
HCC,
and let's pick a private one. How about Rollins?
Rollins. Okay, so you'll have to remind me of those. So we've got 5 colleges. Here's my question for the audience. How many financial aid applications do you think that Kathy's family is going to have to complete for Liam? You don't have to type it in the Q&A, but just think about this question for a second. I'm guessing probably many of you are answering 1. Some of you might be thinking 2. The answer you're going to find out is 8 and at a maximum, and let's talk about how that's possible. So let's start with number 1. And by the way, Kathy, as we go through, I'm going to ask you a date question, and the answer is always going to be on the upper right-hand corner here. I make it really easy. It's always October 1st. Okay, FAFSA. So you're going to have with Liam a FAFSA that you're going to complete, and that is required by all colleges. Now, has Liam already applied for admission to all of those 5 colleges? Say no.
No.
Yes. Okay, good. But you know he's going to apply for admission to those. But he might. He's thinking about applying for admission for those 5 colleges. So should we go ahead and do the FAFSA and list all 5 colleges now, even though he hasn't applied for admission yet?
Yes.
Yes. Great. So you do not have to be admitted. You don't have to even have major application for admission yet to list a college on the FAFSA. In fact, we advise go ahead and list the college if you think there's a likelihood the student's going to apply for admission, right? And the FAFSA is required by all colleges. Online, you can list up to 10 colleges. And if you need more, there's a process by which you can remove those colleges and add more later. But you want to make sure that you do that FAFSA. FAFSA can be done online at fafsa.gov, or you can use your handy dandy cell phone and use the My Student Aid application to submit it. Hey, Kathy, when does the FAFSA go live? When's the earliest date that a student can complete the FAFSA?
October 1st.
Brilliant. Yes, October 1. FAFSA goes live on October 1st, and it goes live October 1st for the following academic year. So on October 1st, we are turning on the 2022-23 FAFSA. Families can complete that FAFSA, and they should as soon as possible after October 1. Now, it doesn't mean you have to wait up till midnight and be the first person to file, although I will say every year the federal government does let us know who was the first person to file. They don't tell the name, but they say often it's someone in like Nebraska who happens to be up at 12:01 and submits the first FAFSA. But I will say to you, as long as you get your application in the first couple of months, October, November, you are fine. But it's important that you meet whatever deadline, priority deadline the school establishes, and you get your FAFSA in early, because the early bird in this case definitely gets the worm. There are some funds that are limited and run out, and it's given in priority generally to students who apply early. So we got FAFSA, that's the one application. Let's talk about the second application. So what is the second application? That is the CSS financial aid profile. And of your list of 5, Kathy, one of those colleges is going to need that form, and that is Northwestern. So Northwestern is a school that generally gives out money of their own, money that comes from their own private source. And that those funds, right, are used to provide grants to offset their expenses. And what you'll find out when you look at the CSS profile webpage, which I've linked there for you, is that there are a number of colleges around the country that do request the CSS financial aid profile. In Florida, Rollins, by the way, is not one of them. Rollins does not need the CSS profile, but I know Stetson does, and I know University of Miami does. So you want to check the CSS profile list for your colleges and to see if a family's college is listed. If it is, then the CSS profile is required for their institutional funds. And remember, I said the largest source of grant was private institutions. So if you're going to a school that needs this form, or your student is, they better complete this form, because otherwise they're not applying for grants from that institution. So Kathy, when does this form go live?
Sorry, just unmuting. October 1st would be my guess.
You're exactly right. And I will say there's been some interesting news in the last couple of days. This is why we love doing these presentations, because breaking news happens all the time. The breaking news on the CSS financial aid profile is the College Board, who runs this service, has announced that any family earning $100,000 or less a year will be able to use the form for free. In the past, it was limited to those earning about $45,000 or less, or those who had a public needs tested benefit. But they've actually expanded the number of families that will be able to use this service for free. If you have to pay, it's $25 to register and about $16 for every college you list. So again, that's a wonderful expansion for families who need to do this service. So we've got one FAFSA, one profile. What's the next kind of application? The institutional application. So we had 5 colleges. It's possible that each one of Liam's colleges may request an additional application to document information for their own purposes. I'll tell you about what we do at Valencia, and I'll invite Karima to say a word about what they do at UCF as well. At Valencia, we have a private foundation that provides scholarship assistance to our students. We have an application for those scholarships. If a student never does the application, we don't know to give them a scholarship. We have no way of matching them. So at Valencia, we encourage every incoming student to complete our Valencia College Foundation Scholarship application. And that is not a requirement for federal aid, but again, it is if you want to be considered for any of the number of private scholarships that we offer and provide for students. Karima, what about you all at UCF? What do you do?
For admission scholarships, so scholarships that students receive based on their high school credentials, there isn't a specific application process. All of our students submit an application for admissions. Our FTICs, or our first-time incoming students, so that's our students coming directly from high school, they actually are considered for our admissions scholarships in the admissions process. Transfer students coming from one of our state college partners do have to do a transfer application to be considered, or a transfer scholarship application to be considered for transfer scholarships. But in addition to those incoming, what I would call admission scholarships, we also have foundation scholarships here at the university and other internal scholarships. And there is an online application called Access to Opportunities, where our students can complete a one-page application that connects them to the various scholarship opportunities here at UCF. Thank you.
So for Liam, right, it's really important that he find out at those 5 colleges what their requirement is and what they suggest, because if a student at UCF didn't do that access application, or one at Valencia didn't do our foundation application, they would miss out on a source of funding that we don't want them to miss out on. So that's really important. And Kathy, any idea when the applications go live for all of these institutional applications? And be careful, this is a trick question.
Well, before I answer that, how do students find out about this? Is it once they're accepted and then their financial aid folks tell them that, or do they have to be proactive and know to ask for this?
So both. I will answer it. Valencia, it's both, right? So it is publicly listed on our website, and we talk about it all the time in our outreach, but a lot of students miss it. So, it is really, there is some self-drive and self-motivation that's required. We're not going to force a student to go through this process. We really do encourage students to take some self-initiative here.
So since we have the counselors on this training today, what should they be telling students to ask for? Like,
Can you do my
yeah, please.
So what I would say is it's really important, and what I tell students when I speak to students at high school nights, it's really important for you to know each school that you're interested in attending, learning those processes, because they're not going to be one and the same. So as Daniel has demonstrated, there are a variety of different things you might need to do, and it's going to be dependent on that particular institution. But I always tell students, you can always start with that school's financial aid website and go to the scholarship section of their website. It's going to share with the student what that school's processes might look like. And so that's a great starting point. And so if a student is interested in Liam's case in 5 schools, Liam wants to go to all 5 websites and learn what their process may be, and then follow that particular school's process. We know he's going to do the FAFSA. The FAFSA is going to be for all of the schools, but whatever additional steps are required, it's going to vary from one school to the next.
Okay,
Great
advice. Yeah, great. Okay, back to your question. I'm going to say October 1st.
You'd be wrong. So as I said, it was a trick question. The reason being, it really is up to the college. So I know, for example, at Valencia, we turn our application on generally in January. We aim for October, but we're on a slightly delayed cycle. It's going to be school by school determined. And I know one other question for you, Kathy. Liam is not an only child. So Liam has a sibling. What is Liam's sibling name? Remind me.
Sorry, I muted. Sam, my
Okay.
daughter, Sam.
Yes. So when Sam applies for financial aid, just a reminder that in the year that both Liam and Sam might be in college together, you're going to be doing double the work, right? So twice the fun. So 2 FAFSAs, potentially 2 profiles, and applications at each of those colleges. I will say FAFSA makes it easy. You can copy information from one FAFSA to another as a parent, so you don't have to repeat the entry all the time, but the student information is going to be different. And remember, FAFSA and profile are every year. So if the college needs it that you wind up attending, it's an annual form. Same potentially with that institutional application. So we've got 5 plus 2, that's 7. I said before there's 8, so we're forgetting 1. And I'm going to bring my friend Pete Hernandez on the line in just a second to talk about this. Oh, you're good. Talk about this next one. So Pete, you can turn your video on. So here's the FAFSA homepage. When you go to that FAFSA.gov page, this is what you'll see. New to the FAFSA process, and there's information there. But what about Florida? So Pete, let's talk about Florida and describe for us, if you will, another really challenging named application, the Florida Financial Aid Application, or the FFAA. Let's talk about that, and what should families know and counselors know about the Florida Financial Aid Application?
Well, thank you, Daniel. And yes, thank you, counselors, for everything that you do. Now, in regards to the Florida Financial Aid Application, it also opens October 1st. And we want to encourage all high school seniors, no matter their status, no matter their residency status, to go ahead and submit a Florida Financial Aid Application, because by filling this application, they will meet the requirement for the Florida Bright Future Scholarship, which is one of the biggest scholarships in the state of Florida. It is a merit scholarship. It is a requirement to fill out this application. Now, even though students may fill out this application starting October 1st, they will still be evaluated all the way up through high school graduation for their classes that they take, their community service hours, and their GPA. Students will be evaluated all the way up to June 30th of their high school graduation date. So that means this year's seniors, the 22 class, will have until June 30th, 2022 to actually submit test scores. Now, how do they submit test scores? In order to be evaluated for the Bright Future Scholarship, those test scores need to be sent to one of the 12 state universities. That means if you live in Miami, send that to the Florida International University. If you live in Orlando, send that, or in the surrounding area, send that to University of Central Florida. Even if you're not going to those institutions, that's how we at the Department of Education receive those test scores and perform the evaluation. Now, we want to make sure that all high school seniors fill out this application, because in the case of Liam, that he went to Northwestern, if he went to Northwestern and realized that it snows 9 months out of the year and wanted to come back to Florida and defrost, if he did not fill out a Florida Financial Aid application, he cannot reinstate that Bright Futures application. That's why it is important that any high school student that graduates this year by having that application can reinstate that Bright Futures scholarship within the next 5 years if they become eligible or if they go out of state and come back. If those students, however, go into the military or do a service project, that 5-year period begins when their disengagement begins. But bottom line, we want all students to fill out this Florida financial aid application, send those test scores to a state university, one of the 12 public state universities, as to be evaluated.
So Pete, there's some questions already about that. Folks are asking, is that new or has that always been the case?
That has always been the case, but we want to strongly emphasize that in order for us to actually do the evaluation, students and counselors are reminded to please send those scores to one of the 12 state universities. That's for the Florida Academic Scholar and for the Florida Medallion Scholar. For PERT scores that are incorporated into the high school transcript, we will pick those scores up. But when it comes to SAT, ACT, they need to be sent to one of the 12 state universities. This is also very important, Daniel, the police and counselors, that even though the testing agencies are now stating a super score on their test, we at the Florida Department of Education will need every testing date that they have or every sitting in order for us to perform the super score. That means we'll take the best subcomponent score of those tests from every sitting, but we have to have each of those sittings sent to one of the 12 state universities.
And I know one of our attendees said that community colleges didn't know this. I will share that when Pete shared this with me earlier this week, it was the first time I had heard it. So there may be some confusion around this, and we'll work with FAFSA to make sure to get that message out. So as a counselor, if you're hearing contradictory information, Pete is the expert. So I will say to you that it can't be a state college. So if a student wants to come to Valencia, we would love to have them. We would love to have them attend. If they're bright futures, we'd even love them more. However, they can't just send their SAT scores to Valencia. They need to get their SAT scores sent to, that person down the street, Karima Munsell, get UCF those test scores as well, so that they can actually get that information in. Great. Okay, so going back to Liam, and thank you, Pete, for that. And I'm sure there's some other questions you can type your answers to in the Q&A. So as we sort of wrap up for Liam, we've got the 5 colleges, we've got 5 institutional applications, 1 FAFSA, 1 CSS profile, and 1 Florida financial aid application. If we're doing high school math, that makes
8.
That's right. And thank you, Kathy, for letting us play with Liam. And
well, I was just going to say, I'm hearing a collective groan from all of our attendees, because it's hard enough to get, as you know, to get many families to fill out the FAFSA, and yet put it in context of the money they can earn. If we were to equate it to the time you would spend on a job, help them put it in terms that they can communicate to their families of why it truly is worth spending the time to do 8 potentially applications.
Karima may get here, and maybe this is what you're going to talk about, but if I can just say, one of the questions that comes up often is it worth it? And, the investment, to your point, the investment of time, especially for families who think, I'm just not going to qualify. Why should I even bother? And the answer is 2 reasons. From my perspective, number 1, you don't know you're not going to qualify. You may think you're not going to qualify for Pell Grant, but as I showed you before, that's only 14% of all the money that's available nationwide. The FAFSA is your ticket for entry to the whole process. And remember, the single largest source of grant, what's that single largest source of grant? It's colleges and universities. It's not the federal government, it's not the state government, it's colleges and universities. You have to do that application to get into that process. And there's not a hard and fast cutoff in terms of where the income is. The second point I'll raise, and Karima will talk about this more in her section, is what if something bad happens to that family? Let's say, there's a loss of income, or God forbid, there's a death in the family. You want to get that FAFSA in as a protection. Think of it as insurance, because you can always come back and say, I've had a change in my family circumstance. I need some help now. So Karima, I don't know if there's anything else you wanted to add.
I would also add that it is a lot. I mean, when we're talking about 8 applications, that seems daunting. As Kathy mentioned, it's hard to get families to think about the 1 application. A few things I would say is that I think we're conscious of families apprehension of the process, and we have tried to streamline and simplify applications as much as possible, both with the FAFSA and institutional applications. I think the financial aid community at the federal, state, and institutional level are all aware of that level of apprehension, and we try to make the processes as simple as possible. So that's one thing I would say. So while it sounds like a lot, it may not be as much time as the family is perceiving.
Right.
Thing I would say is that when it comes to the FAFSA and encouraging families, I did see a question where it says, how do you encourage families to complete the FAFSA? In addition to having it as a cushion or, a backup plan for some families, you may not anticipate getting gift aid. You may not be Pell or grant eligible or even institutional grant eligible. But there are times, as Daniel says, that even a family who didn't anticipate the need to borrow might have to then borrow because something might have changed in that family situation. So instead of waiting the time for the school to get the FAFSA results and accept the loans, you're really just, it's there for some insurance and a surety. But then the other piece I would say is that some scholarships require the FAFSA, even if it's not need-based. And so that to me has been very encouraging to families who might be middle to high income, who are thinking, I'm not going to qualify for certain types of gift aid. But when you tell them you might be putting yourselves from some free money outside of federal grants, outside of state grants, or outside of even institutional grants, but there might be some other opportunities, even in the private scholarship sector, that might require a FAFSA, but may not require need, that sometimes encourages them to get the application done.
Great, thank you. So we're gonna move ahead now to some more information for you. So we've talked about these forms being electronic. Just a reminder of how families sign them. So obviously you can't sign the computer monitor screen. So what are you doing for a signature? Families are using what's called, at least with the federal government, the FSA ID, or Federal Student Aid ID, and that's a combination of a username and password. Sort of like when you access your bank account or your credit card statement, and students will have to set up an FSA ID, one for the student and one for a parent, to access the system. And that FSA ID is good for their life. So it's a single sign-on that allows them to use it to access, as Karima said, their loan applications, their FAFSA, other information. They can complete that as part of their FAFSA application, or they can do it separately at FSAID.ed.gov. Really important, the one mistake students cannot make is Social Security number mistake. You want to make sure when you set up your FSA ID that you have the right Social Security number as a student. And for those of you that are counseling families who have potentially complicated last names or multiple last names. So if I am Hernando Garcia Romero, right, I want to make sure that when I fill out the FAFSA, I'm putting in my full name as it matches what's on the Social Security card. So if my Social Security card says Hernando Garcia Romero, then I want to make sure to write down on the FAFSA that full name, and the same with my admissions application, that full name, because we always have to match those records. So really important as they go through that they include that. Here's the FSA ID page, just a shot to give you an orientation to that. And now I'm going to get to my big joke for my part of the session, and I appreciate laughter, and that is, it's not a parent who's a parent. Okay, never mind. It's hard to hear you laugh when you're on mute. So what do I mean by that? What I'm talking about is for families who are coming from a divorced or separated household, how do they know who to fill out with on the FAFSA? Who's the parent who you complete the FAFSA with? And there's misconception about this. So I want to address this and make sure you're clear. For students who are from a divorced or separated household, the family that they fill out the FAFSA with is the family they live with. So if the child lives with mom, mom is who's filling out the FAFSA. We don't put information about dad on the FAFSA. If the child lives with mom and stepdad, then mom and stepdad are who you fill out the FAFSA with. It's who the child lives with. That's the custodial household. That's who fills out the FAFSA. If, let's say, the child lives equally, half with dad, half with mom, then the question comes in, who provides more financial support? Only in that case does it look at the finances. Who gives more money to help support the child? Notice, by the way, it never asks who claims the child on the tax return. That doesn't matter for this purpose. For FAFSA, it's all about who the child lives with, or if that's even, who provides more financial support. Some colleges, mainly private colleges that use that CSS profile, may want information about the non-custodial parent, the other parent. So in my situation, child lives with mom and stepdad fill out the FAFSA, but if they're attending, let's say, MIT or Harvard or Yale or Princeton or maybe Boston College, they might ask dad to fill out a separate application so they can look at dad's information as well. Not for federal funds, but some colleges may want to do this for their own funds. I will say this is an area that there are some major changes coming in 24-25. So I'm not going to talk about the changes now because I don't want to confuse people, but I will say keep in touch because this is all going to be a little different in 2024-2025. Okay, the other question we often hear from families and from students is, am I dependent or independent? Why does this matter? If I am independent, then I don't have to put my parents' information on the FAFSA. But if I am dependent, I need to include my parental information. So how do I know? If you as a student can answer yes, if the student can answer yes to any of these questions, then they're what's called independent, and they don't need parental information. So that would include, will I be 24 years of age or older? Am I working toward a master's or doctorate degree at this time, right? Not in the future, but right now. Am I married? Is the student married? Does the student have children of their own, dependents of their own whom they support? Are the parents deceased? Are they in foster care? The student, are they a ward or dependent of the court? Are they legal guardianship? Unaccompanied youth at risk of homelessness or homeless? Serving in active duty or a veteran of the U.S. Armed Forces. If any of those are yes, the student's independent. Otherwise, the student is considered dependent. Now, I know many of you work with students where they don't quite fit this model. What do you do with those students? What if the situation is unique? And Kareem is going to talk more about this, but generally they can apply for what's called a dependency override. They can apply to be determined to be independent, and that's at the discretion of the college. An individual college makes that decision. They would start by filling out the FAFSA without parental information, and they would contact the college and ask for a review. Worst case scenario, they can borrow an unsubsidized loan on their own, but if the college agrees that they're independent, they can in fact be called independent and qualify for aid on their own, but it's at the college's discretion. And again, Karima will talk more about this in her section. So the other thing I want to talk about is what year's information am I using? So for students attending this coming academic year, 22-23, the FAFSA goes live in about a week on October 1st. They're going to be using income based on the last completed tax year. And that last completed tax year was what year? That was 2020 itself, right? So 2020 was the last tax year that we had information for. So it's going to be based on the 2020 tax year. That's income information. Asset information and information about who's living in the family is going to be based on when they file the FAFSA. But what if the family's information is different? What if, let's say, there's a loss of income in 2021 or 22, or God forbid, there's a parent who passes away? What happens in those situations? In those situations, there's an option called professional judgment, where a family can apply to have a college redetermine their aid. And again, Karima will talk more about that as we go forward. There's also a great entry on my blog page about this, which is referred here below. How does your information get to the FAFSA? When you link up the FAFSA with the IRS, when a family applies completing the FAFSA, they can link to what's called the IRS Data Retrieval Tool, or DRT. And the information from the IRS will get directly transferred right onto the FAFSA. This is great for families. It makes it much easier than trying to type in the information themselves. They won't see the data when it transfers. It will be protected for their protection, but it does make the application process much easier for them. We strongly suggest they do this because it does make the process easier for them, and it also lessens the chance that they will be selected for verification. There's a question about what happens if families haven't finished filing their 2020 taxes. Even if you got an extension, most families should have their taxes done by October 1st. If families still are not done, they can file with estimates and then update with their actual information once that is complete. Another question about if a student's attending summer session, which tax year and FAFSA form do they complete? So summer it depends on the college. That's an it depends question. For most Florida colleges, most Florida public colleges, summer is considered a trailer on the academic year that is just ending. So I know at UCF, I know for us, summer is part of the past academic year, but that's going to depend college by college. So you may need to ask the individual college what their plan is. So for a student coming to us for summer and fall, they're going to have to do both academic years FAFSAs, both academic years application.
Daniel, do you mind if I would venture to say that for our students who are even thinking about summer school, when I do high school nights at this time of year, I encourage them to go ahead and just get both done. Because if you're even considering summer school, it's better to be prepared than to wait. The application closes on June 30th of the year that they're starting summer school for that, if their school is a trailer. So it's just better for them to go ahead and get it done and not start the summer semester in a deficit trying to go ahead and get the FAFSA done at the last moment.
Agreed. So what is verification? I mentioned verification. So let me define verification. Verification is a process where about a third of the students nationwide are selected to have the information on their FAFSA proven. And this is a federal requirement. It's not because we at the college have decided we want to force you through this process. The federal government requires that you prove what you submitted on the FAFSA. And if you're selected for verification, the college will be in touch with that family and may ask for copies of tax forms if the family didn't use the data retrieval tool, which is why we advise families use the data retrieval tool. The verification form itself and other information like proof of identity, high school graduation status, etc. There's a question about that summer thing. Is that true across the state? Varitza, yes. Most people do require, most colleges in Florida do require that summer is a trailer. I don't know if any of my colleagues on the line want to type or answer or unmute and say if they're different, but I know most of the colleges in Florida, summer tends to be, if they offer summer, it tends to be a trailer to the academic year that just ended. Okay, so my last topic before I turn this over to my good friend Karima to talk about her section is how does the money get awarded? So we've talked a lot about need-based financial aid and need, but we've also talked a little bit about merit-based financial aid. So you heard Pete earlier say that Bright Futures is a merit-based program. As a reminder, families don't have to fill out a FAFSA to qualify for Bright Futures. We encourage them to, but it's not a requirement. Need-based financial aid, you do have to do the FAFSA or the CSS profile, but some colleges use a structure called merit within need. And what I'll say about this is for colleges that give out their own money, they may prioritize students who have high desirability for that college. So it's not unheard of for a college to take, within context of their need-based programs, to take a look at who is the most desirable student for their match. And in that institution, to prioritize spending need-based grant to those students, to sweeten the pot, if you will. So as a counselor, as a high school counselor, I would advise when you talk to families, we often talk about a reach school or a dream school, right? Having within the range of schools that students are applying to, a school that is a reach for them or a dream for them. I would also have within their range of schools that they're applying to, a school where, in a sense, the student is a reach for that school. Where is that student going to go where the school's going to say, this is one of our best students, right? And for many students, you'll be able to find that. Not all, but for many. But that may give you a sweet spot where that college is going to put some money on the table to help recruit that student to come attend for them. So we're going to do something fun. Karima, I'm going to ask you to unmute and turn on your video, and maybe Kathy, you can play with us as well when we do this last little piece here, because it's fun to sort of, do this as a group. So for the rest of you, as we transition, I'm going to ask you to fold your arms. So everyone fold your arms. Look down and see which wrist is in front or which wrist is showing. So how many of you is at your left wrist? Show of hands.
They can also raise their hands too, so you
Oh,
can
that's
see it
right.
that way as well.
That's right. You can raise your hands using the feature within Zoom.
Raise hand. Yep.
Yep. If you want to raise your hands, we can see how many of you have your left wrist. So that's 43 so far. Okay. So you all are what are called visual learners. That means you process information by seeing it. So if my screen goes blank, that'll drive you crazy. Chances are you're probably taking notes during this presentation because you learn information by notation. You also love music. Music is a passion for you, but you can listen to music while doing other things. It doesn't distract you. Okay, how many of you had your right wrist showing?
So we have to have them lower hands now.
Yeah, lower hands. Thank you. And for the rest of you, hopefully, that should be the rest of you, right? All the rest of you should have your hand raised now because you have your right wrist showing when you fold your arms. I'm looking at the numbers. You all are what are called auditory learners. You process information by hearing it. So if every word, that would drive you crazy because I've just skipped every other word, right? You like music, but music does take your full attention. You can't listen to music and work simultaneously. Okay, lower your hands, please. For how many of you did that not describe you? Be brave. You are not either of those things. Karima, how about you?
Okay, so Daniel, I have a bit of a quagmire determining whether I'm a visual or an oral learner because I had my left the last time we did this and the right this time.
So you are confused to no end. So I would put you in the third category. And that third category, if it doesn't work for you, you're what's called a kinesthetic learner. That means you learn it by doing it. And so there is a job opening in my office coming up, and I'll expect your resumes in submission for that job opening because the best way for you to learn financial aid is just to jump in. Okay, here's the fun part. Try folding your arms the other way. Unless you're Karima, at which point you know that that's already possible. But for most of us, that might feel weird or uncomfortable, right? And you can lower your hands now. Thank you for playing. Why did we do this? There is a point to all of this. As I turn this over to Karima, Karima's going to describe for you visual learners, an image that you can take away to sort of wrap up a number of the things that I've said as she starts her section. She's going to describe it for those of you that are oral learners. And as I said, we'll be collecting resumes at the end for those of you that are kinesthetic learners. So Karima, talk to us a little bit about this weird concept of a financial aid barrel. What is a barrel?
So the financial aid barrel is a way to really visually perceive the cost of attendance, the expected family contribution, and the various resources a student may have to assist with their educational expenses. So we're going to start with the expected family contribution. In this particular case, the student has a cost of attendance of $25,000 with an expected family contribution of $5,000. That's going to leave us with a $20,000 need. Daniel, I appreciate the round numbers that you have utilized in this demonstration. So we know that the student has $20,000 in unmet need that could be taken care of. Those particular educational expenses can be taken care of with a variety of resources, financial aid resources specifically. So we're going to look at the type of gift aid the student is receiving. Gift aid is money that comes in the form of grants and scholarships. It does not require repayment, nor does it need to be earned in the form of work. In this particular case, this student has $7,000 in grants and $6,800 in scholarships, a total of $13,800 in gift aid. So we're starting to chomp away at that $20,000 need that the student has. So in addition to the gift aid, this student also has some self-help aid that they're going to utilize. They have a $3,500 direct loan and a $1,200 work study offer. So if the student takes advantage of the self-help aid available to them in the form of work and loans, that's an additional $4,700 that the student has to assist with their educational expenses. So now the student has an unmet need of $1,500. The reason the unmet need is $1,500 is because the student, we're going to take into account the EFC, that $5,000 that's going to come from the family typically, or at times students could find other ways to accommodate their EFCs by looking at future income. So we're going to go to the next slide and talk about how do families pay for their expected family contribution. And I am going to be a straight shooter and very transparent. I know for a lot of our families, particularly our middle income families, when they see their expected family contribution, it is a number that does not make sense to them. When they see that number and they're looking at, well, where would I find money to support my student in this manner? There are a variety of ways that they can consider funding their students' educational expenses. If they have any savings accounts, particularly savings accounts that they may have the 529 to assist with the students' educational expenses, this is the time to tap into them. If they are currently employed, gainfully employed, and able to, they can utilize their salary, look into whether or not that institution has a payment plan, what that school's payment plan policies are. So for example, at UCF, we do have a payment plan, but our payment plan is only available to our students who do not have financial aid of any sort, because our students with financial aid get the same payment date as our students with the payment plan. So there's no need to enroll in a payment plan at UCF if your student has financial aid. However, different schools have different types of payment plans. So you may want to reach out to that school's. Typically, that's going to be the bursar or the student account office. That's not going to happen in financial aid. If the student is a self-paying student, meaning the student is not using financial aid resources,
Karima's screen has frozen. So while we're waiting for her to come back, Daniel, are you able to step in?
Sure. So again, as Karima was saying, oh, you're back. We lost you there for a second.
oh, did you? Are you able to hear me now?
We are. I
just got the note that said my connection was unstable. So hopefully, and you know what, I might turn off my camera in case that might be what's draining my resources. I'll continue to talk. Daniel, if you can't hear me, I have my phone, so just let me know by text. So what I was saying is that families can use future income, and future income is often comes in the form of student loans. And the most common loan for a family is the parent, or not common, but one loan that a family could use is the Parent Plus loan. And the Parent Plus loan stands for the parent loan for undergraduate students. And it is a credit-based loan. It is offered by the Federal Department of Education, and it allows the parent to borrow up to the student's cost of attendance to assist with the student's educational expenses. So in this particular case, this student had a $1,500 unmet need and $5,000 in the expected family contribution. So the parent could borrow $6,500 to ensure that the student's cost of attendance needs are met. Also, I would keep in mind that the cost of attendance is an estimate. So some students are able to utilize their financial aid package without every single component in the cost of attendance being met. So there are times when a student does not need to borrow up to the cost of attendance, or a family. Can move on to the next slide. So some insider tips. I cannot stress how important it is for our students to know their schools that they're interested in attending, the deadlines. Each school has what we call a priority filing date. The priority filing date varies from one institution to the next. What I like to share with students is you want to make sure you get your FAFSA done by the earliest priority filing date of all of the schools you're interested in attending. So I know there's a huge push. We're trying to get our students to do the FAFSA in October and November. There are some schools, UCF included, that have throughout the month of December and January. So it's really important for students to go ahead and file their FAFSA as early as possible. But keep in mind, the FAFSA might not be the only date. The FAFSA might not be the only date that students are looking for. There are other applications, there are other deadlines, there are institutional applications, institutional requirements. So that matrix will help students stay on top of the various deadlines that are occurring. And we know that some of our students are very much digital natives, so it might not be a paper matrix. It might be that they're utilizing whatever app or calendar features that they utilize in their phones, but they want to keep note of all of those upcoming dates. And then they want to keep copies of anything that they're sending. So if they're sending a verification worksheet to an institution. Keep a copy. If you're updating an institution with residency information or anything that you're submitting to an institution, you want to ensure that you have a copy of that. The students want to keep a copy of that. If you have questions, ask. We're here to help. And we're also here to provide our guidance counselor community with the information you need to assist students with the college going process, specific financial aid process. So we really want our students to know that they have multiple areas of support in the college going process, starting at the high school and also in the institutions that they're interested in attending. Don't rule out a college or an institution just because of cost. Cost, when we look at the cost of attendance does vary from one institution to the next. But as Daniel mentioned, we really want to look at the net price of that institution. It may be very possible that the student's financial aid package at an institution that is at a higher cost makes up for a greater portion of the cost of attendance and maybe leaves the students with a lower net price. It's really important for the students to look at the net price to try to compare apples to apples, because all schools are going to be different. The cost of attendance will vary from one institution to the next. The student's financial aid package will vary from one institution to the next. The student wants to take a look at all of their resources, look at how much gift aid they're getting at particular institutions versus their self-help aid, particularly loans, to determine how they're going to finance the cost of that particular institution and explore all of the options available to them. Go on to the next slide. Thank you. So where does financial aid come from? So financial aid comes from the federal government. Some of the common federal programs are federal grant programs, such as the Pell Grant. The Pell Grant is specifically based on the expected family contribution. The EFC is the number, as we've mentioned before, that the federal processor comes up with when the FAFSA is submitted. Students are Pell Grant eligible based on their EFC. Other federal grants include like the Federal Supplemental Educational Opportunity Grant, and there are other grants available through the federal government, but those two will probably be the most common that a student would see. Also, the federal government provides our federally funded student loans, our federal direct subsidized loan, where the government pays the interest for our students who have need and who are enrolled at least half time or in a period of grace or deferment, as well as our federally funded Parent Plus loan that I just spoke about. State government, our state actually does a great job supporting our students with a variety of grant programs. The one that comes to mind to me is the Florida Student Assistance Grant, which is a need-based grant funded by the Florida Department of Education. But the program that we hear the most about from our state government here in the state of Florida is our Florida Bright Futures program. And so the Florida Bright Futures Scholarship Program is a state scholarship in which the student must meet the specific academic criteria at the high school level in order to meet the eligibility to be a Bright Futures recipient. State colleges and universities, or whatever college or university the student chooses to attend, often has institutional funds available. And as we mentioned before, there may be different processes to tap into those institutional funds. So it's really important for students to figure out what the process looks like at each institution the student is interested in attending. A variety of private agencies support students by helping them fund their educational expenses. Religious groups such as your church or your synagogue is a place where students can find scholarship, as well as, community and civic organizations like the Rotary Club, the Elks Clubs, fraternities, sororities. These are all spaces within the community that are willing and often support students in funding their educational expenses. And then professional associations. I know that our association does provide some students with scholarships. And so students want to look at the various professional associations in their state. And it's not just your financial aid administrator association. There are other professional associations throughout the state that might be looking to cultivate the next generation in that particular profession. So you want to look to see if they're offering scholarships as well. And then your parents' employers for our students. A lot of and even in some cases, the student's employer, I would venture to say, a lot of employers are supporting their employees by helping with family educational expenses. So that might be in a tuition reimbursement program, it might be through a scholarship program, but it is definitely worth looking into if that is an option based on the student and or the parent's employer. So scholarship searches. Is there money out there? The answer is absolutely. Can I get any of it? Yes, but what I like to tell students is scholarships are truly about tenacity. And they are really about being very consistent in your scholarship search. So I tell students to apply often. The student may not get most of the scholarships for which they apply, but the student who applies for many scholarships increases their likelihood of receiving some scholarships. FastWeb is a great source. They are going to connect students with a variety of scholarship opportunities, and it's a pretty easy setup. Students just set up a profile, create their unique email address or add their unique email address, and then they are going to get a list of scholarships that the student seems to meet the criteria to receive. What I would say is that, again, it's about being tenacious, and it's also about being prepared. When it comes to essays, some students just blow that off. I don't want to write an essay. I don't have time, whatever it may be. So I tell students to ensure that they are prepared for when a scholarship opportunity becomes available. So I encourage students to create a scholarship template. That scholarship template is outlined 3 paragraphs max, but probably 2 will suffice, where the student is highlighting anything that any donor may want to know about them, and ask you to please use your POEM acronym as to how students can really highlight themselves when developing scholarship essays.
Yeah, so as Karima said, so I've developed an acronym that stands for POEM, and I think it's a really good way to help students sort of narrow in on what to write about. And this is true for college essays, it's true for essays regarding admissions applications, et cetera. So what does POEM stand for? So I'm going to walk you through it. And I talk about this on the blog. If you go to, there's an entry, if you go to the scholarships category on the blog, where we talk a lot about this as well. So P in POEM stands for passion. So Karima, what are you passionate about? What's the thing you love more than anything else in the world that's not work? I know you're passionate about your work, but what else are you passionate about?
I enjoy writing, Daniel.
You enjoy writing?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, awesome. So, so for Karima, it might be writing. For me, by the way, it's community theater. I love community theater. I'm an actor, singer, so I love, that opportunity. That's probably not going to surprise many of you on the call, but that's a thing I love to do. So that's my passion. Oh, what's the opportunity? So where did we find an opportunity to express that passion? When I was in high school, I got involved with community theater in the city of Charleston, which is where I was living at the time. And that was an opportunity for me to express my passion. What was an opportunity, Karima, you had? Do you remember?
Breaking up a little bit, Daniel. So did you ask what opportunities have
Yep.
I had to write? I actually have cultivated my writing in a variety of different ways. I've submitted my poetry, and especially when I was younger, I submitted my poetry and contests and that kind of stuff.
Awesome. And so that's right opportunity. E stands for experience. So, and I won't make Karima give the rest of these, but experience, where in that opportunity, what was a particular experience you had that connected to your passion? So for me, it was a performance of A Christmas Carol that we did in the Dock Street Theater in Charleston, South Carolina. And what M stands for moment. What's the individual moment that really connected to that passion? And for me, it was the opening curtain of A Christmas Carol opening night, when the curtain raised and I was the first person on the stage. I was playing Bob Cratchit, and I started the first musical number for the show. So I can now write about that moment and what it felt to be in that moment. And that became an essay that I could then use to talk about my passion, to talk about really everything that connected. And there was an easy way to connect that to each essay. So again, if POEM helps your students, it's a good way to refine that passion, opportunity, experience, and moment. Thanks.
Thank you. And so, Daniel, the other thing I would say is that for a lot of our students, one of the recommendations I have for them is that they also want to do what I call a scholarship resume. And what I refer to as a scholarship resume is not something that the student is going to print. It's more so a bulleted Word document where the student has an experience that makes them a good scholarship candidate, whether that's that they participated in a community service event, or they received an accolade at school, or they were, denoted to be the highest in a certain category. Just bullet that information on a Word document. High school is a long time, 4 years, and for our students who are very active, it's easy to forget some of the great work that they're doing that makes them a great scholarship candidate, and B, for a lot of students, it is a difficult task to toot their own horn. So it allows them to kind of just go back to say that is being requested. And then also, we just want to remind students that there may be an additional scholarship application at your school, as well as maybe in your major or program. So students want to make sure that they know what those processes are at their institution. All right, so the financial aid calendar. When it comes to getting applications ready to go, we are gonna go back to what Daniel said when he was speaking with Kathy. Financial profile becomes available on October 1st. And you wanna go ahead and have your students complete the process as early as possible. On November 1st, many schools are making early decision deadlines for the profile and the FAFSA. So you want to go ahead and make sure, again, our students are getting things in early. And they want to take the months of November and December to complete forms. If they're being requested to submit any verification forms from their Office of Student Financial Assistance, if they're being requested to submit any additional admissions documents, they want to go ahead and get those in. And I want to bring up why it's really important for a student to have a complete admissions file. And in requesting of the student, even if it's not specifically financially related, we want to make sure that our students are getting those things in a timely manner. For some schools, early decisions are mailed as early as December. And the months of December through February, a lot of deadlines start to pop up for a variety of different schools. Again, it's really important for students to be cognizant of the deadlines associated with the schools that they are going to attend or they are interested in attending. When it comes to late February, early March, the school might be asking for more information from the students. Here it says the school may call you, and while some schools may call, students should also monitor their email accounts. Most schools use email as their official way of communicating with students. And by the end of March and early April, students are going to start getting more admissions notifications, and their financial aid award notification or their financial aid summary will be mailed to them so that the students are now getting that information about their financial aid package, and they can start to render those decisions about what their net price might be at a school and factor in the costs into their decision-making process. So in April, students want to start to compare those award letters that they're getting, and again, factor in costs for the decision-making process. And May 1st is often considered decision deadline. And that's when you tell the schools, I'm interested in attending this institution, and you may need to pay a deposit for your tuition, room, and board. And if a student isn't interested, it is also a great courtesy to let that institution know that they do not plan on attending that particular institution. In June, July, students are going to take a look to see if their bills have been generated for the upcoming fall semester, and then determine when their due date is. And again, going back to knowing your school's payment policy, not all schools are the same. At UCF, our students who have any financial aid will receive what we call a deferment. Their tuition deadline is extended. They do not get dropped from their courses for non-payment. That is not the same at all institutions. Daniel, can you explain how fee payment works at Valencia?
Absolutely, yeah. So at Valencia, we do have a deadline for fee payment. And if your full bill is not either paid or covered by financial aid or some other source, your classes are dropped, and that is before the semester begins. So you want to make sure at Valencia, and this is state colleges generally aren't allowed to carry a balance for students. So I know at other institutions I've worked at, you're allowed to carry a balance. We encourage you to pay, but you're allowed to carry a balance through the end of that particular semester before you're blocked from the next semester. So each institution may have slightly different policies around this. Some of it's statutory, some of it is just the business choices those individual institutions make.
Right. And so I just want to drive home the point of the students understanding the process at the institution that they're attending. That's really important. And before you know it, just like we are just days away now, the FAFSA becomes available again for the next year. And then the billing cycle for the following semester comes up as well. So if you need more help, because we are going through a lot of things today, these are a few resources. The FAFSA website is where our students are going to complete the FAFSA, but it's also a great space. I go there to get familiar with the FAFSA each year. As we have learned, I'm a kinesthetic learner, so I like to do. And so going to the FAFSA and looking at it is helpful for me. The College Board CSS financial aid profile, as Daniel mentioned, many private institutions, universities, and colleges use the CSS profile to determine how they will allocate institutional funding. FinAid.org, I know that as a financial aid administrator, I utilize this website quite often. It is written in layman's terms. It is easy to understand. It provides us with great information on a variety of different financial aid topics. And then Daniel has his Money Man blog that is also a great resource and tool for financial aid administrators and those of us assisting students with the financial aid process. And then each college has not just a financial aid office. Of course, we have our financial aid professionals willing to assist and help our students navigate this process. But I know that for us, we have a really comprehensive financial aid website. So if a student isn't able to get onto campus, the website is a really great starting point. And then they can reach out to the financial aid office in a variety of different ways. We do email, we do virtual appointments now. We have our in-person walk-ins as well as phone services. So students have a variety of ways that they can reach out to college financial aid offices to get more assistance with the process. And so some unique situations, if you're considered a ward of the court, an emancipated minor based on legal emancipation, if you were in a legal guardianship where custody was awarded to someone other than your parents legally, or if you're a homeless or an unaccompanied homeless youth, if you're a student at risk for homelessness or an unaccompanied homeless youth, you are independent based on the questions outlined on the FAFSA. However, sometimes there are unique situations where a student cannot answer yes to those specific questions. One of the common ones I see is that a student might have indicated they're in a legal guardianship, but technically it's not really a legal guardianship. So there wasn't the appropriate court process to make it a legal guardianship. So while the student cannot answer yes to that question, there may be times when we're able to consider, as Daniel mentioned earlier, what's called a dependency override. We can move on to the next slide. So there are some other unique situations. So there are times when a student may be a citizen, but their parents are not, and the parent may not have a valid social security number. As Daniel mentioned earlier, the student will need a valid social security number in order to submit the FAFSA, but the parent does not. If a parent is undocumented, if a parent lives outside of the country, or if the parent is here on a visa that does not issue a social security number, that is all fine. If that is the case, then the parent would utilize all zeros when inputting the social security number. However, I just do want to reiterate for our students, we do require that our students are citizens or eligible non-citizens, and I will get into that a bit more. So our US citizens are students who were either naturalized or are granted citizenship status at birth. However, there are a variety of different non-citizenship statuses that are eligible to receive federally funded financial aid, such as our permanent residents, anyone who holds a alien registration card. Our students who are in a refugee or asylum granted status. And I like to say the asylum granted status because sometimes we have students who have applied for asylum, but the process isn't complete. If the student hasn't completed the asylum process, then the student is not considered a eligible non-citizen until that process is complete and asylum has been granted. Our Cuban Haitian entrants are considered eligible non-citizens, as well as parolees, conditional entrant parolees, T visa holders, any battered immigrants, and then citizens of the Republic of Palau, the federal states of Micronesia, and the Republic of the Marshall Islands are all considered eligible non-citizenship statuses. When it comes to our students who are eligible non-citizens and the difference between our eligible non-citizens and our DACA students are not eligible for federally funded financial aid. They may submit the FAFSA if needed for a private scholarship or for institutional consideration, but the students will not be deemed eligible for federally funded financial aid. However, they want to reach out to their colleges and particularly look in many instances at private scholarships. Most private scholarships do not have the stipulation of a student being a citizen or eligible non-citizen. So if there is a private scholarship that does not specifically indicate that the student needs to be a citizen or eligible non-citizen, we can encourage our students who are DACA, TPS, any other undocumented status or international students, they can be encouraged to apply for those private scholarships. And depending on the institution that the student is attending, the student may be able to tap into some institutional funding at that particular school as well. So professional judgment is a terminology that we use in financial aid, and it allows us as the financial aid administrator to utilize information that is different than the information that has been provided on the FAFSA. We most often use it when a family's income that is reflected on the FAFSA does not necessarily reflect the family's current financial situation. So this could mean that there might have been a loss of income due to employment changes, such as a family being unemployed or a reduction in, or a family member being unemployed or a reduction in hours. If one member of the household is no longer in the household, such as a divorce, if unfortunately a parent has passed away, or if a family has excessive medical bills that have been paid and there's documentation of payment, these are times when a professional judgment may be a possibility for that family. Keeping in mind that the FAFSA is based on 2 years prior information, things can change. And so what a family wants to do if things have changed is they want to reach out to their Office of Student Financial Assistance at the school that they plan on attending to start the professional judgment process. And what they do in that process is every school does this slightly differently. And so a lot of things in financial aid is very regimented and is outlined by our regulations. When it comes to professional judgment, each school is given some leverage to perform professional judgments in the way that works well for their particular institution. So what I would say is the student wants to reach out to the institution that they're attending, learn about that school's professional judgment process, what documentation they'll need to submit, and get the process going as soon as they can so that the student can have an idea of how the change in their familial situation impacts their financial aid package. Next slide, please. So what happens if a parent is unwilling to provide parental information on the FAFSA? So if a parent is unwilling to provide parental information on the FAFSA and that parent provides no financial support to the student can reach out to their financial aid office for what their process is for parental refusal. And so each school, again, may have some different types of documentation that the student wants to submit that certifies that their parent is unwilling to complete the FAFSA and does not provide any financial support for that particular student. And in those cases, if the school deems that this is the case, the student may receive some financial aid in the form of the unsubsidized loan. And so this is the loan that does begin accruing interest when it disperses, but it does provide students who have no other options with the opportunity to receive some support for their educational expenses. What if a student has been abused or neglected by a parent? And so there is a process called the dependency override appeal. If a student has a unique parental or familial situation, we encourage our students to go through this process. If they cannot answer yes to the questions outlined on the FAFSA pertaining to dependency status. So what I will share in regard to this is, with our dependency override appeals, we do need documentation. Typically, we're looking for letters of support from a third party, a trusted member of the community, such as a social worker, sometimes guidance counselors, DCF, police reports. I know in our office, we often have students who have started to seek mental health counseling to work through some of the familial problems. So we'll take information from their counselor to assist us with understanding the complexity of that family situation. And so this is an opportunity, again, for students who may have a more complicated familial situation, victims of abuse or neglect, or even, as I mentioned before, there are times when maybe there wasn't an official legal guardianship, but they've been in the care of a family member who would not qualify as a parent on the FAFSA. Move on to the next slide, Daniel. And so that concludes our presentation. I apologize for not being able to utilize my video, but I wanted to make sure you could hear me to the best of your ability, given the technical issues I'm having on my end, but we definitely want to answer any questions you may have.
But so I would say if someone's video would have been broken, it should have been mine, because I've often been told, Karima, that I have a face for radio. So you, on the other hand, people would be pleased to look at. So there we go. That's the wrap up. We're happy to take your questions and comments that you have. I know, Kathy, do you want to join us and see if there's any questions that are coming through that we'd like to address?
Sure. One of the things that we hear often when we're talking to students who are aging out of the foster care system is they don't know that there's benefits of it, tuition benefits and housing stipends and other forms of support available to them. I know it's one of those where many, if not most, if not all counselors know that, but somehow the information still isn't getting out. So can you share briefly what some of those benefits are for them?
Yeah, Karima, do you want to tackle this or do you want me to start?
We can tag team, you can start.
Okay, so I know that foster students can qualify, especially if they were in foster care, can qualify for tuition waivers at the state college, within the state college system. That often is handled by an agency or an office outside of the financial aid office, again, handled by someone on the academic side. So it depends college by college within the state college system, but it's important for that outreach to take place. Again, for students who are in foster care, they need to establish their independency by doing a dependent override. And at least in current law, we do have to confirm that information hasn't changed each year. So each year they go through the process, they have to complete the application. I'll just say a word. You know, one of the things that I struggle with about our process is, and I know guidance counselors will feel this as well. I think, you know, unfortunately, the way our processes are built, we do sometimes have to have students relive their trauma and relive their trauma again and again, sadly. And I, you know, when I have these conversations with students and when my staff does, we start the conversation by apologizing and saying, we don't want to force you to relive your trauma. We acknowledge it. But the requirement we have for documentation and for audit is we have to build a case. And that means you being as disclosing as you can be to us about what really happened, because that's the only way we can prove your situation. And so, you know, that can be triggering for some, and we recognize it, but it's really critical for us to be able to present the whole picture so we can make the case of why, you know, a dependency override should be made, for example.
I would totally agree. And I train my team, and we come from a position of empathy when we do these. It is a difficult conversation. And you're right, Daniel, we often start the conversation with an apology because we know that we are for a lot of students, they might have buried this as far down as possible so that they can continue to move forward. And we're rehashing some hurtful things in order for them to get some financial aid. So we definitely recognize that. The other thing I would say as it relates to foster youth specifically, in addition to the waivers that they may receive, based on aging out of the foster system, I know that at UCF, we have a dedicated person to supporting our foster youth here or our students who were once foster youth here at the university. So I think it's important. And Daniel, I don't know if this still exists. There was a time where there was like a foster youth resource network with the state colleges and the state universities. And I feel like it's dissipated over the years, but that might be something worth revisiting.
I appreciate you throwing that out there. I was just about to put it in the chat out to everyone. So the Positive Pathways Network in Florida is made up of all of the campus success coaches or the campus liaisons for students who are aging out of foster care. I put the link in the chat.
Awesome.
They not only have information on who are those people at each of the institutions, and they keep that updated regularly, but they also have listed under their programs and liaisons tab is the community-based care contacts by region. And they have set up regional points of contact because they know some institutions have better supports than others. So those regional points of contact are kind of like your go-to one-stop shop person to help kind of maneuver through colleges or universities who may not have as robust of a system. So I shared that with them, and I encourage you to get to know those regional points of contact in your area so that you can, hopefully, as Daniel was saying earlier, we don't want to re-traumatize students, and we want to have those warm handoffs so they know that they have the support they need.
And then the other piece to that, with both the dependency overrides and professional judgments, I say it's like us piecing together a puzzle. And so there's a lot of, the more pieces we have, the clearer picture we have. And so when we're talking to students initially, if we can provide them with that context and that guidance, that's really helpful. And then sometimes, but writing down certain, and I'll give an example. I had a student who was doing a dependency override, and she spoke to abuse at the hand of one parent, but she just wouldn't mention the other parent at all. And so we reached out to her to kind of get a bit of a background, and she was very sympathetic to her mother's challenges and struggles in life, and she didn't want to out her. She just didn't want to do that. And so, but when we conversed, she was able to share with me some more context that painted a clearer picture, but she wasn't comfortable writing that at the time, and I explained to her I needed it to be able to render the decision. But sometimes there's a cultural context, sometimes there's an emotional tie, and it's very complex situations that we kind of have to walk our students through.
Let me ask you this question, because I've heard one of our school districts say, we have a similar challenge with undocumented students is sometimes they don't know they're undocumented, and sometimes they don't want to disclose that for safety reasons. So, one thought is make the information available to all students so that if they haven't disclosed their status yet, they still are finding out about this. And I'm almost wondering if we need to be considering doing the same thing with these types of supports for foster youth as well. Your thoughts?
I would say yes. And I would also say that just to be, students who've aged out of foster care, that's one group, but the complexity of familial situations, it really runs the gamut. It's not, it doesn't fit into nice, neat boxes. I call this, a lot of things in financial aid is black and white. A lot of the things that we do are black and white. We know we can, we know we can't. In this realm, this is our fuzzy gray area. This is where things get a little bit more complicated, and situations are very unique and individual. And so we have our students who have aged out of foster care, but we also have our students who may not have been in the foster system, but they have a very complex family history, and they also need support.
And so I'm going to take you to a related spot that we hear often about is what do you encourage our counselors to do for parents who refuse to share their information for FAFSA purposes?
I'll start with that. I mean, I think one of the things that one of the analogies I use is trying to explain to families the difference between filling out the FAFSA and committing to pay for college. What I often hear from families is, I don't want to fill out the FAFSA because I'm not going to be able to afford it, or I'm not going to pay for my kid's education. Okay. Filling out the FAFSA doesn't obligate you to pay for your kid's education. All it does is determine whether or not your student's eligible for financial aid. So there are two separate decisions. The first is filling out the FAFSA. The second decision is paying for college. And I try to separate out those two from each other. It's a little bit like applying for a credit card or a car loan or a mortgage, and then signing the actual promissory note. You've never signed the promissory note when you fill out the application. You can always change your mind. So I start by differentiating between those two. The other piece is trying to dive a little further into the why. Is the why behind it because A, the parent doesn't want to pay, B, the parent and student have never had a conversation about what's really affordable, C, because the parent may not be kosher with tax filing, with whatever it might be, or D, is there some breakdown in that family relationship that really we should be looking at to talk about independency? And so that's where it gets a little muddy, right? So I've seen situations where this is and I'll use this term among friends, right? This is a power trip from the parent to the student to sort of hold this in reserve and say, I don't want you to go to college. I don't want to let go of you and my household. And then it's a conversation about that family relationship, a dynamic, and understanding where is the drawing line at which that student is now really independent. What are your thoughts, Karina?
I totally agree. I think that we support our students in a variety of different ways, and different parents see completing the FAFSA differently. That's the best way I can say it. And for some families, they do feel like they're obligating themselves and committing themselves. And unfortunately, we are not given the leverage to just consider a student independent because they're financially independent. We don't have that leverage. So the FAFSA specifically outlines what renders a student independent. And I think it's important for families to understand what that means. But I will tell you that there are some families that will absolutely, no matter how you explain it, no matter how you encourage it, they're just not going to do it for the student. They're not going to do it. And to Daniel's point, there are sometimes a very complex dynamic where the parent might be utilizing it as a control factor. And so when we have these unique situations, that's when we look at the parental refusal or the parental non-assist process, and looking at potentially utilizing the unsubsidized loan to assist a student with their educational expenses. The other thing is, if a parent has absolutely refused to do the FAFSA, the student also wants to start potentially their scholarship search even harder than the student who has a FAFSA on file, because there might be private scholarships available to the student to help them fund their educational expenses where the FAFSA may not be needed. But on the other hand, when I'm encouraging families to complete the FAFSA, one of the things I share with them is that the FAFSA is required for some scholarships, and that helps them to feel encouraged to do it. So it's not about the loans, it's about the free money. And so, but it really depends on the reason the family isn't, or the parents are unwilling. It can be complicated.
So I know a question has come in. I would just want to address this. Actually, it's come in twice. I love that people are thinking this. So they're asking about ability to use the presentation in their own materials and their own slides. And I will say to you, imitation is the sincerest form of flattery, right? So you certainly have permission to reproduce and use the materials in your own presentations. I can't even tell you the number of people who have given me permission to put this PowerPoint together. The idea of the bucket or the barrel, I heard for the first time as a neophyte financial aid officer in Massachusetts in the 1990s. So, if I were to source down the credit for all of this, it would be impossible. I would love if you're willing to offer as you go through the Moneyman blog so people can stay in touch and get more information as it updates, but you are free and welcome to use the information that we've shared with you today in your own presentations as you go forward.
Absolutely. Thanks. Yes, we appreciate that because the more you can help students and parents understand this process, the better it is for them and their ability to pursue their education. We probably have time for maybe one more good question. And I think the other thing I hear a lot is we need students and families to be thinking about this and starting much earlier. I think that question is always a little, yes, but what and how, and because FAFSA, we don't want them starting in junior year, unless because it won't do them any good if until they're going the following year. And so, to both of you, how and what should we be introducing students and families to earlier so that it isn't this big overwhelming thing senior year?
So part of it is, again, some of the things we talked about today, that students can certainly start by looking for scholarships now. There's no reason to wait, right? Some scholarships have, access or information available to them, or you can apply for them as early as middle school. So that's one area.
Absolutely.
The second I would suggest is that students can certainly start by looking at that net price calculator. It's a great piece of information to start evaluating what kind of costs would they be expecting or should they be expecting by the time they're interested in going. And really, in part, the high school journey is about, as our counselor colleagues know, about the exploration of the higher education system. There's so many different types of institutions and so many different institutions that just simply learning about the types and learning about the experience, and including as you start doing virtual visits or actual visits, asking questions about the paying for it part. Don't forget that is part of, or should be part of, your conversation, right? Often, it would be like going to buy a car and never asking what the cost of the car was, right? Or what your payment options might be. You want to explore that as you're doing the counseling tour, because that is also important.
Absolutely. I would reiterate the scholarship piece, as well as while the student may not be able to get the FAFSA done in junior year, we do know that. I think it's important to plant the seed early, that they know the process is coming, and then also to demystify it. I think there's a lot of apprehension, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of angst that families experience when it comes to the FAFSA. And over the years, the FAFSA is not the FAFSA of yesteryear. It is definitely much more intuitive. It's a smarter tool, and it is not as daunting as families may perceive it to be. So kind of demystifying it, reassuring families that while it is a process that you do have to complete, as I mentioned before, I think state institutions, private institutions, the federal government, our state Department of Education, all recognize that families are doing a lot of applications, and we have tried our best to streamline the application process at all levels. So it is not necessarily as daunting as you may perceive it to be.
Great. And I know Pete had mentioned that Bright Futures classes are being planned. Do you want to jump on real quick and share a little bit about that?
Yes, we ask all counselors to make sure that students are preparing as early as middle school when it comes to taking the appropriate classes, not only to get into the post-secondary school of their choice, but to earn those scholarships, those grants, those merit-based scholarships. And utilize the resources such as FCAN that uses a lot of resources for that college planning, for the Florida Department of Education, for the institutions themselves. And we know counselors go above and beyond in trying to teach those students, but it seems like when it comes to their senior year, then the light goes on and they're trying to account for all the classes that they missed through their entire year. So the planning starts as early as middle school, but if they have a good plan, their freshman, sophomore, junior, and senior year, this can become very, very easy process. And especially if you train the high school juniors of what's coming up next year, it makes it a lot more easier process to understand, comprehend, and to succeed in.
Great, thanks, Pete. I appreciate that. I shared this at the beginning. I know some folks, came on a little later, so I just want to reiterate this. Karima actually is going to be coming back to join us on the evening of October 19th from 6 to 7:30. It's going to be a FAFSA how-to. So she's literally going to be showing students and families how to walk through the FAFSA live. We will have volunteers again from our friends at FAFSA to help answer their questions in the chat. That registration link is live now, so please share that out with your students and parents. We'll continue to reinforce that in our upcoming e-blast. We also had some folks ask for some specific resources. So I just want to remind you that FCAN has resources you can tap into. In Tuesday's session, we had several folks ask for, like, how do I motivate students to complete the FAFSA, which is part of why we created the top 5 reasons to complete a FAFSA. It's a handout on our Cash for College page. On the same web page, you will also find these other 2 handouts, which are the common FAFSA mistakes in both English and Spanish, and what do you need to complete the FAFSA? So what do you need to have ready to complete the form, again, in English and Spanish? We have a couple of upcoming webinars that you might be interested in. The first one on September 30th, which is part 1 of our Promise of Florida HBCUs. And then on October 7th, we are going to be sharing research highlights from a partnership between the Hope Center and Helios Education Foundation on supporting the college success needs of Black students. So you're not going to want to miss that. So if you are not already registered for the College Ready Florida initiatives, I encourage you to do so. That way we'll make sure you're getting all of these updates. And if you want to subscribe to our newsletter, that will also keep you informed of upcoming webinars. So with that, many, many thanks to Daniel, Karima, and all the rest of the volunteers who helped answer questions today. And many thanks to all of you for the work that you're doing to help students and for taking the time to log on today. Thanks for joining us and have a great weekend.
Bye,
Bye now.
everyone.
Bye, everyone.